I'd like to talk to you today about life extension. Let's begin with the known. As you can see from the slide, we've made astonishing progress in life extension over the past 100 years. Considering the rapid pace of technological advance and the widespread dissemination of awakening and healing technologies, bigger jumps in life expectancy are soon to come. Eradicating heart disease, something we know how to do, could immediately make a big dent. There are 6 factors which contribute to heart disease. By funding simple programs to address these factors, we can add 7 years to many people's lives. Before we go further, we must answer a simple question. Why would we want to extend human life in the first place? According to Michael Ray of the SENS Research Foundation, we might take long-term impacts of short-term decisions more seriously, in part because of an awareness that the consequences would accrue to each person personally instead of to children or grandchildren. If I'm going to be around for 400 years, I might reconsider polluting my water supply. Mr. Ray also mentions the clear and unambiguous benefits. Living with Alzheimer's disease is a terrible thing, fraught with suffering. Ending aging also means ending age-related diseases. Another point. Life currently is a game we can't win. Currently we all die, and most of us fear death. Perhaps this is why we play the game with such ferocity. Well, what if we change the rules of the game? Think of how much of the fight in our lives would drop away. Think of how much calmer we would become. A John Lennon-esque thought, I know, but still worth considering. Finally, for me, there is a profound spiritual implication of life extension. I subscribe to the reincarnation model as espoused by many Eastern religions. It occurred to me recently that Groundhog Day is a great illustration of this model. Who said spirituality has to be serious? We live, we die, we are reborn. And we repeat this process until we become enlightened, until the dewdrop of the ego dissolves into cosmic consciousness of existence. If this is true, the question becomes, if after I die I am going to be reborn anyway, why bother with life extension? The thing is, the method that nature gave us is somewhat inefficient. In our youth, we need to relearn the basics over and over. How to crawl, how to walk, how to talk. We need to pass through that awkward adolescent stage, and so on. If we are lucky, we have from age 20 to 80 to learn a few life lessons and to burn a little karma. Then, many of us get sick and then we die. And then we do it all over again. I've created a kind of crude graphic showing this point. The top section shows the standard reincarnation model, and it shows a person mastering 6 life lessons. And the years, the time it takes, is somewhat arbitrary, but it's for illustration purposes. Now the bottom shows how long it would take to learn those same 6 life lessons if you were in one body. You didn't have to relearn the childhood things. and you didn't have to get old and die and float around in the ether. So those vertical yellow bars show how long it would take in either case to learn the 6 lessons. So notice how much sooner the person who's living in one body learns the lessons and clears out the karma. It would be much more efficient if we could live 1,000 years in one body, feeling totally alive, healthy, and young. We could spend 20 to 30 years in as many careers as we like, learning lesson after lesson, living intensely and passionately. After 400 to 500 years, if all the mystics down through the ages are correct, we would likely come to see that nothing in the external world is going to fill the void inside. And therefore, we would embark on the inner search. In another 100 years or so, after meditating, doing yoga, and so forth, we would likely wake up. This timing gives us another 400 years to be a wise, loving, compassionate person with tons of life experience, working alongside the other awakened ones to create heaven on earth. Heaven on earth, because enlightened leaders would only embark on activities and policies which lift humans up, which are win-win across the board in every dimension. For me, this was the insight that was needed. Extending the human lifespan creates the possibility to end a tremendous amount of human suffering, created by unconscious people making unconscious choices in every walk of life. Here's one simple example. If an enlightened person was the head of Exxon, when she or he was presented with the prototype of an electric car, which can be charged with solar panels, she or he would say, "Of course this is what we need to do. It is a much healthier solution to private transportation on so many levels than the gas-powered car is. Work out the details and let's get to it." So, now that we are passionate about the idea of life extension, let's look at the technologies and processes, both existing and on the drawing boards, which, when taken together, can give us a real boost towards a dramatically extended life. The technologies I've subdivided into the 4 headings listed on the slides. So the first one is going to be supplements. And there's a gentleman named Ray Kurzweil who takes hundreds of supplements per day. And he has a website, and what you're seeing is the list of supplements from his site. The world of supplements is something like the Wild West in the 1800s. There are many, many approaches and not a whole lot of science yet to back them up. You can go online and find all kinds of different programs, and one that I found was presented by a man named Dr. Pompa, and I presented the information, what you need to search on YouTube in order to find him. When we look at nutrition and exercise, aside from the obvious things, there is a method called calorie restriction. Now, this is the only fully proven method for extending life in all of the animals it's been tested in. Research in many animals has shown that a 30% reduction in calorie intake leads to a 30% extension of life. So that's a very promising modality. Also, some people are saying that certain kinds of exercise not only increase your fitness, but also extend your life. In the allelopathic world, there is a huge amount of research going on. I'll mention only a few items as listed here on the slide. To begin with, I'll give sort of a basic overview of one of the cellular causes of human aging. So sit back and enjoy the video.
While many search for the proverbial fountain of youth, you might be wondering, why do we age in the first place? What is it about our bodies or cells biologically that causes us to grow old? There's a variety of internal and external factors such as diet, exercise, or environmental stress which all contribute to cell damage and repair and affect the rate of aging. But the surprising truth is that, apart from these, we actually have a biological clock buried within our genetic makeup. And this clock can only run for so long. In other words, we're programmed to die. Your body is made up of trillions of cells which are constantly going through cell division, and every time they divide, they make a copy of their DNA as well. This DNA is tightly packed into structures called chromosomes, of which humans have 23 pairs. The problem is, DNA replication isn't quite perfect and skips over the end of each chromosome. To protect against important DNA information being cut out, we have something called telomeres on the end of chromosomes, which are essentially meaningless repeats of DNA that we can afford to lose. But every time our cells divide, these telomeres become shorter and shorter until eventually they've been entirely stripped away, at which point the cell no longer divides. Some flatworms are able to endlessly regenerate their telomeres, making them effectively biologically immortal. But their lifespans do vary, and they're still susceptible to disease, further suggesting that aging is a mix of genetic and environmental factors.
Next, I'd like to bring to your attention a man named Dr. Aubrey de Grey. He's a very, very interesting man doing very, very interesting work. I'll let him give you his take on things.
In an audience of TED or TEDx, it is very controversial to say that I am working on the world's most important problem. But I really am, and this is why. Aging kills 100,000 people every day. That's twice as many as all other causes of death added together. 2/3 of all deaths are from aging. In the industrialized world, it's 90% of all deaths. It's an insane number. And of course, it's not just the death. It's the suffering that goes before the death. So it's all about health. It's all about looking and feeling and functioning just as well as you did when you were 25, however long ago you were born. But still, people say these things. You know, people, first of all, they just don't listen. They think that it's all about being in a bad state of health for a very long time. They think that the elimination of aging is a bad idea because they can't work out what they would do, or they can't work out where we would put all the people, or they don't think that it's going to come along in time for them. And of course, they don't care about their children at all. I mean, goodness me. So I think it's all about this. I think it's that aging is so horrible, so scary, that we have found it necessary to put it out of our minds and pretend that it's not horrible at all. And it doesn't matter how we do that, so long as we can, so long as we succeed in tricking ourselves into the idea that aging is a good thing, even though it doesn't look like a good thing. That made perfect sense. It was a rational thing to do until very recently. Because until very recently, nobody had any idea what to do about aging. But now we do. Now we are within a reasonable distance, within striking distance, of developing medicine that really brings aging under the same level of medical control that we have already today for most infectious diseases, like, tuberculosis or whatever. This is the regenerative medicine approach. We can call it the maintenance approach. Essentially, what this is, we say, let's not try to interfere with the process where metabolism creates damage, or the process where damage eventually causes the diseases and disabilities of old age. Instead, let us separate those two processes from each other by going in and repairing the damage. And this is the damage. Of course, everything I have said so far has been very dry and theoretical, and maybe it'll work and maybe it won't. in order to actually justify what I've said so far, I have to give you some details. The great thing about damage is that it's not very complicated. There are only 7 major types of damage that we need to fix, 7 major types of side effect of the body's normal operation that build up throughout life and eventually contribute to the diseases and disabilities of old age. And here they are. And as you can see, they are proper, real, concrete biological phenomena. But here's the really good news. We can be pretty confident that this list is comprehensive. The reason we can be confident is twofold. First of all, it's been the same list for 30 years. All of these things have been talked about for at least 30 years and researched by people who study the biology of aging. We've come a very long way in biology in that time. You would really have thought that the list would have got longer if, it could have done. But also, the list has not been an explicit list until I came along. I started talking about this more than 10 years ago and challenging people to say, okay, what's missing? Is there anything missing? And no one has come along with anything that can be convincingly added to this list. So that's pretty good news. But only pretty good. The really good news is on the next slide. We have a fair idea how to go about actually fixing all of these things. The reason that this classification of damage is useful is because for each category we can describe a generic therapy that can be used for each of the types of damage to actually implement the maintenance approach, to get rid of these types of damage.
Next, I'd like to discuss the gene therapy which is created by the drug telomerase. So just as a quick refresher, I'm going to replay the segment of the video on the telomeres and the chromosomes.
The problem is, DNA replication isn't quite perfect and skips over the end of each chromosome. To protect against important DNA information being cut out, we have something called telomeres on the end of chromosomes, which are essentially meaningless repeats of DNA that we can afford to lose. But every time our cells divide, these telomeres become shorter and shorter until eventually they've been entirely stripped away, at which point the cell no longer divides.
Alright, so we've got the chromosome, and remember that the blue on the end of each chromosome is called the telomeres. And each time the cell divides, we lose some of those telomeres. And once all of the blue stuff is gone, the cell cannot divide anymore. And that's very bad news for continuing to live. But there is a new drug called telomerase, which actually adds to the blue stuff on the ends of the chromosomes so that they can continue to divide for a longer period of time. So this is a very exciting process that they're working on. Finally, I'd like to talk to you about Dr. David Sinclair and the sirtuin genes. I'm going to let him explain what the sirtuin genes are all about.
Yeast cells do in fact grow old, and one of the reasons is that their genes start to switch on as they get older. So what I mean by that is that every cell has a set number of genes. We all know that. In every one of your cells, same number of genes, but they're not all switched on at the same time. They need to be kept on and off, and tell what type of cell is in the liver and what type of cell is in the brain. And what we found was that these yeast cells, as they got older, after about a week, all the genes started to come on, and they died. Now we could find genes that could actually slow that process down. We could find genes that could switch off those rogue genes and silence them. And this led to a discovery of a longevity gene called SIR2. And SIR2 stands for Silent Information Regulator number 2. We soon discovered that there are 7 of these longevity genes in our bodies. We call these the sirtuins. So if we zoom into the cell, you'll see a chromosome, and if we stretch out the chromosome, that's the DNA, all twirled up there in gray. The pink blobs are proteins called histones that the DNA is packaged in. Red means the gene is off. The problem during aging is that chemicals come in and stick to the histones and turn the genes on. So that's what the green lights mean. This gene that should be off in the brain of my grandmother is now coming on, and that's a terrible thing. And if this gene happened to be a gene that told the liver to be a liver cell, and now it's on in the brain, you can imagine the problem. And that's what we think may be a large part of what happens during aging. This leads to a really important possibility. We used to think that mutations, these irreversible changes to our DNA, are what cause aging. But in fact, if it's this what we call an epigenetic change, that's reversible. So let me show you how we can reverse it. So these sirtuins, they actually make proteins that I'm going to show a cartoon of. It's going to look like a Pac-Man. And what the sirtuin proteins do in our body is that they clip off these chemical groups, see? And now the gene that was on in the old person, green, goes off again. And that's what the sirtuins are doing in our bodies right now.
In addition to the allopathic approach, we have many psychospiritual modalities, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And the ones I'm going to talk about are listed on this slide. First of all, there's the Chinese meditation practice called Qigong. Now, there are many stories of Chinese Qigong masters who've lived very long lives. And there are eyewitness accounts of a man named Li Qingyuan. Apparently, he outlived 23 wives to the ripe old age of 248 years. He wrote in his book that the secret to longevity was his daily Qigong practice, a spare vegetarian diet, which harkens back to the caloric restriction diet that we talked about earlier, and a regular consumption of Chinese herbal tonics. Qigong has also been shown to boost the production of DHEA, and this substance is listed on Ray Kurzweil's page as a supplement to take to extend aging. Now, we have so many healing modalities that all seem to bring more light and delight and openness into our lives. Whether it's Reiki or acupuncture, kinesiology or homeopathy, there are so many modalities that open our acupuncture meridians and lead to a more flowing, light, delightful life. And I can't help but think that this is going to help us to live longer lives. And finally, I'd like to talk about Dr. Emoto and his work with water, consciousness, and intent. You can see from the picture, there's a picture of some water, and he has a process by which he can photograph the crystals of the water. On the left, you see what the crystal looks like before a prayer of love and beautiful intention. And on the right, you see what happens after the prayer. Well, this is what happens in water, and Dr. Emoto has run many, many experiments in many different contexts to show that this really works. When we consider that the average human is around 60% water, you can imagine what bringing that kind of loving intent will do to a human being. Imagine if instead of greeting people with, "Hello, how are you?" we greeted them instead with, "I bless the water within you," and really blessed the water with our hearts, with our loving intention. We could really brighten things up a bit. So, the last thing I'd like to talk about is our intent. So how much of our time, energy, and resources are we willing to donate to life extension? and not just for ourselves, but for our children and grandchildren. The technologies are here. It's just a question of funding and skill and assembling the best practices, and we can dramatically extend life in the very near future. In my opinion, it's going to be a combination of all of the approaches mentioned. An east-west melange of techniques, which is going to bring about a planet filled with awakened beings working to create heaven on earth. Thank you for listening.